It was a quiet morning in a small, peaceful neighborhood. Birds were chirping and the sun was just rising over the rows of neat houses. Inside one of these homes, a man lived a life that seemed ordinary to anyone passing by. He was calm, disciplined, and kept to himself. He spent his mornings tending to his garden, reading books, or doing light exercises. To the outside world, he was a quiet, unassuming man, the kind of neighbor who never caused trouble and always nodded politely when someone passed by. But this morning would be anything but ordinary. A loud, sharp banging on the front door jolted him from his morning routine. He froze for a moment, listening. The noise came again, more insistent this time. Voices shouted from the other side of the door, demanding he open up immediately. The man's heart beat faster, but his face remained calm. He could hear the heavy boots on the porch and the tense, hurried tone in the voices. These were not casual visitors. He walked to the door slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves. Through the peephole, he saw uniformed officers, their faces hard and serious. They claimed they had a tip about illegal activity in his house. The man knew immediately that something was wrong. He asked them politely to show a warrant, explaining that they could not legally enter without one. His voice was steady but firm. The officers ignored him, their tone growing more aggressive. They insisted he step aside, shouting orders and waving their guns. He could feel the tension building. His mind worked quickly, scanning the situation. He had been trained to stay calm under pressure, to think ahead and to make decisions that kept him in control. Every movement of the officers, every word they said told him more about their mindset and their lack of professionalism. He noticed the hesitation in some of them, the overconfidence in others. The balance of power in the room was fragile, but he had the skills to navigate it. Before opening the door, he took a deep breath and assessed his surroundings. Every piece of furniture, every exit point, every object in the room became part of his mental map. He knew how to use space to his advantage, how to move without causing unnecessary confrontation, and how to protect himself if things escalated. The officers, unaware of who they were dealing with, continued to shout. They were convinced this was a simple situation, a routine search, and they had no idea of the experience and training the man had. He opened the door slowly, hands visible, speaking in a calm, controlled voice. "I need to see your warrant," he said. "I will cooperate if you follow the law." His tone was steady, commanding respect without raising his voice. The officers, expecting resistance or fear, were momentarily thrown off by his composure. One of them stepped forward, trying to assert dominance, but the man's presence made them pause. Despite his calm, the officers began moving into the house, ignoring his repeated requests for legal proof. They started overturning furniture, rifling through drawers, and shouting at him to stay out of the way. He stayed calm, aware of every move they made, every sound they produced. His training told him that patience and observation were key. There was no need to act rashly. The situation was still manageable. As they searched, the man's mind drifted briefly to his past. Years of rigorous training, missions in extreme conditions, and experiences in life-or-death situations had prepared him for moments like this. He had learned to stay calm when surrounded by danger, to read the intentions of those around him, and to control his own reactions. He remembered the countless drills, the tactical exercises, and the mental discipline that had become second nature. It was this training that now allowed him to remain composed, even as the officers violated his home and personal space. The tension in the room grew. The officers were becoming more impatient, frustrated by the lack of evidence and the man's unwavering calm. They shouted accusations, tried to intimidate him, and even made threats. But he did not flinch. He knew that showing fear or anger could escalate the situation. Instead, he focused on controlling his breathing, observing the environment, and preparing for the next steps. Every instinct, every learned skill was ready to be used if necessary. One of the officers, noticing the man's calm demeanor, whispered something to a colleague. They began to hesitate, sensing that their assumptions about the situation might be wrong. The man noticed the shift in their behavior and kept his movements minimal, maintaining a posture of quiet authority. He knew that the key to resolving this without violence was patience and clear communication. Hours could have passed in that moment, though it was only a short time. The man continued to speak calmly, explaining his rights and requesting the proper legal procedures. He reminded them that any illegal action could have consequences. all while keeping his body language non-threatening but firm. The officers were caught between their assumptions and the reality of his presence. The realization that he was not an ordinary man began to creep into their minds, though they could not yet place why. Finally, the man decided it was time to reveal just enough to change the dynamic. Without raising his voice or making sudden movements, he mentioned his background. He spoke of his service, his experience, and the discipline that had defined his life. The officers, still uncertain, began to recognize that their actions might have been reckless. They paused, exchanging nervous glances as the weight of the situation started to sink in. The calm authority of the man, combined with his clear knowledge of tactics and law, shifted the energy in the room. The officers were no longer confident, no longer in full control. They realized that their assumptions had led them into a dangerous situation and that they needed to reconsider their approach. The balance of power had subtly changed, all because the man had remained composed, observed carefully, and used his experience to navigate the threat. The morning sun continued to rise, casting light on the scene inside the house. What began as a routine, aggressive intrusion had transformed into a tense standoff, with the man fully aware of his surroundings and the officers beginning to recognize their misstep. Every detail mattered, every movement was calculated, and the patience and discipline he had developed over years were proving invaluable. By maintaining his composure, speaking clearly and showing controlled authority, he began to take back the psychological advantage. The officers, unsure of how to proceed, slowed their movements and lowered some of their aggression. They were beginning to see that this situation was no longer simple, and that any rash actions could have serious consequences. Through it all, the man did not let anger or fear dictate his actions. He stayed focused on the goal, resolving the situation without harm. He knew that his ability to control his emotions, communicate effectively, and use his training wisely would determine the outcome. This was not about intimidation or force. It was about strategy, patience, and understanding the behavior of others. As the standoff continued, the officers slowly started to retreat, realizing that their lack of preparation and understanding had put them at a disadvantage. The man had turned the situation into a lesson in discipline, calm, and authority. By remaining composed, he had shifted the balance and protected himself, without needing to resort to violence. The morning air was filled with tension, but also with the quiet strength of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of. Every sound, every movement, every word mattered. The officers were no longer in full control, and the man had successfully used his experience and training to navigate a dangerous and unpredictable situation. The events of that morning would leave a lasting impression on everyone involved, proving that calm intelligence and discipline could overcome reckless force. In the end, the man remained in his home unshaken, while the officers slowly backed away, realizing that their assumptions had been dangerously wrong. The quiet neighborhood outside remained unaware of the extraordinary tension that had just unfolded within its walls. The man returned to his routine, calm and composed, knowing that he had successfully defended himself and his home, and that his skills and experience had once again ensured his safety. The tension in the house did not ease even after the officers slowed their movements. The man remained calm, aware that any small mistake could turn the situation dangerous. He kept his hands visible and his body relaxed, showing no aggression, but every fiber of his being was alert. His mind worked quickly, analyzing every movement, every word, every tone in the room. He had learned in his life that patience and observation were sometimes stronger than any weapon. As the officers continued their search, he noticed inconsistencies in their behavior. Some moved with overconfidence while others hesitated, uncertain. This gave him an opportunity. He decided to guide the situation without escalating it further. He spoke in a calm, even voice, explaining that any further illegal entry could result in serious consequences. His words carried authority, backed not just by knowledge of the law, but by the presence of someone who had faced life-and-death situations countless times before. The officers paused again, their confidence shaken. They realized that they were dealing with someone far more capable than they had expected. The man did not need to shout or threaten. His calm and composed presence alone created a sense of authority that could not be ignored. The atmosphere in the room hanged. The officers, once bold and loud, became careful, cautious, unsure of their next steps. During this tense standoff, the man thought about his past missions. He remembered operations that required extreme precision and control, where the smallest mistake could mean the difference between life and death. Those experiences had shaped him into someone who could remain unshaken under intense pressure. Every training exercise, every mission had taught him patience, awareness, and strategy. These lessons were now in play in his own home, and he was using them wisely. He moved slightly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He positioned himself where he could observe every officer, every exit, and every piece of the room. He was ready to act if necessary, but he also knew that confrontation could be avoided with the right approach. He began to engage the officers verbally, asking clear questions about their intentions, reminding them of legal boundaries, and pointing out the dangers of acting without proper authority. His voice remained calm, but every word carried weight. The officers' impatience grew, but so did their uncertainty. They whispered among themselves, their movements less aggressive, more tentative. The man noticed this shift and understood that control had begun to subtly tip in his favor. He stayed composed, carefully guiding the interaction without escalating it. The key was to show strength without aggression, authority without intimidation, and awareness without panic. At one point, an officer leaned over a piece of furniture, seemingly unconcerned, but the man's trained eyes caught the subtle hesitation in his body. He calmly stepped closer, speaking softly but firmly. "Please be careful. Any sudden move could be dangerous. Let's handle this the right way." The words were simple, but the impact was profound. The officer straightened up, visibly more cautious, realizing that he had underestimated the man. The man then decided to reinforce the reality of his abilities without revealing everything. He moved with precision, demonstrating control over his own body and his environment. Each action was measured, deliberate, and confident. It was a quiet display, but it communicated a clear message. He was not someone to be rushed or underestimated. The officers began to understand that they were in the presence of someone highly trained, someone capable of handling extreme situations with calm and skill. He continued speaking, calmly instructing them on how to proceed safely. He reminded them of the importance of following legal procedures and respecting boundaries. His tone was firm yet non-threatening. It was a delicate balance, one that he had mastered through years of high-pressure experiences. The officers listened, some reluctantly, some with growing respect, realizing that their previous assumptions were dangerously wrong. Time seemed to stretch as the standoff continued. The sun had risen higher, casting light across the room, highlighting the tension in the faces of the officers and the calm resolve of the man. Each passing moment tested their patience and composure, but he remained steady. He knew that a single mistake could change everything, but he also knew that patience and careful communication could resolve the situation without violence. He reflected on the principles that had guided him through his life: discipline, observation, and strategy. Every mission, every challenge he had faced had taught him that the mind could be the greatest weapon. He applied these lessons now, using his words, his posture, and his awareness to manage the situation. The officers, once aggressive and loud, were now cautious and hesitant, their energy subdued by the calm authority of the man. Gradually, the officers began to slow their search, their confidence shaken by the man's composure and subtle display of skill. They whispered among themselves, unsure of how to proceed. The man noticed the change and decided to maintain a steady, non-confrontational approach. He continued speaking in clear, simple terms, reminding them of the law and the potential consequences of acting recklessly. His presence alone communicated control and readiness, reducing the risk of violence. The tension in the room was palpable, but it was now balanced by a sense of careful restraint. The officers realized that they were dealing with someone exceptional, someone who had faced extreme situations and had the discipline to remain calm and effective. Their movements became slower, their voices quieter, their aggression replaced with caution. The man had turned a dangerous situation into a controlled standoff through patience, awareness, and subtle authority. He thought about the importance of perception. To the outside world, he appeared calm and composed, but inside, every sense was heightened, every detail observed, every potential threat considered. This awareness allowed him to act decisively if necessary, while also giving him the ability to guide the situation toward a peaceful resolution. He had learned that true strength often came from restraint, from understanding the environment, and from controlling one's own responses. As the minutes passed, the man maintained a steady rhythm of communication, observation, and subtle action. He never raised his voice, never made sudden movements, but every word and gesture conveyed authority and control. The officers, now fully aware of the situation, began to respect his presence, realizing that they had underestimated the man's capabilities. Their earlier confidence had shifted to caution, and they were beginning to see the wisdom in listening rather than acting impulsively. The man's mind was focused on the larger picture, resolving the situation safely and ensuring that the law was respected. He continued to guide the officers through calm instructions, reminders of legal procedures, and subtle demonstrations of awareness. The balance of power in the room had shifted, not through force but through careful control, patience, and strategic communication. Finally, the officers began to retreat, realizing that their initial approach had been reckless. They moved slowly toward the door, their actions deliberate and cautious. The man allowed them space, maintaining a calm presence while observing every movement. He knew that giving them room to withdraw was essential to avoiding escalation and ensuring safety for everyone involved. By the time the officers left the room, the man had successfully navigated an incredibly tense situation. He had maintained control without aggression, guided the interaction with skill and calm authority, and ensured that the law and safety were upheld. The neighborhood outside remained peaceful and quiet, unaware of the extraordinary events that had just unfolded within the house. The man returned to his routine, taking a moment to breathe and reflect. He had faced a potentially dangerous situation with calm intelligence and strategic thinking, relying on his training, discipline, and awareness. He understood that his ability to remain composed, observe carefully, and communicate effectively had been the key to resolving the standoff safely. He knew that this experience would stay with him, a reminder of the importance of patience, observation, and control in every aspect of life. The officers had left, but the lesson was clear. Preparation, discipline, and calm authority could turn even the most dangerous situations into manageable ones. The man had once again proven that true strength lay not in aggression, but in the ability to remain composed, aware, and in control, even under extreme pressure. The officers had stepped back for a moment, regrouping in the hallway, their faces tight with tension and uncertainty. Inside the house, the man remained calm, his posture relaxed but his senses sharp. He could hear every movement, every whispered exchange between the officers, and he could feel the shift in the energy around him. The realization was sinking in. They were no longer in control, and he knew that it was the perfect moment to guide the situation further without causing violence. He decided it was time to reveal a bit more about himself, not to intimidate, but to prevent a mistake that could end badly for everyone. He spoke softly but firmly, making sure each word carried weight. "I need you to understand something important about me," he said, his voice steady and calm. "I've spent my life in situations where split-second decisions mattered, where lives depended on precision and awareness. I know how to handle extreme pressure. I am trained for this." The officers froze for a second, unsure how to respond. The calmness in his tone suggested experience and authority, far beyond an ordinary citizen. The man's mind worked quickly, assessing the room, the positions of the officers, and every object that could be used. Years of tactical training had taught him how to anticipate moves, how to stay ahead in a dangerous scenario. He could feel the officers' unease growing as he spoke. They had entered a situation they believed they could handle easily, but now the dynamic had changed. The confidence they had carried in was replaced with doubt, uncertainty, and a quiet fear they struggled to hide. As he continued, he focused on keeping the atmosphere non-threatening, but firm. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said, "but I need you to follow the law and do this the right way. Any wrong step could have serious consequences. Let's avoid that." His calm authority, backed by his presence and knowledge, created a pause in the room. Even the most assertive officer hesitated, realizing that the man's words were not empty threats but statements grounded in experience and capability. He then moved deliberately, slowly shifting to a spot where he could observe everyone without seeming aggressive. His movements were precise, controlled, and measured. This was his way of signaling that he was aware, prepared, and in command of his space. It was not a show of strength but a subtle display of skill and discipline. The officers began to notice, exchanging nervous glances as they recognized they were no longer dealing with an ordinary man. The man's mind replayed fragments of his past missions, moments when he had faced life-or-death challenges. He remembered training exercises where he had to stay calm under fire, make decisions in seconds, and control his fear while assessing the risks around him. Those lessons now guided him. Every word he spoke, every movement he made was deliberate and informed by years of preparation. He was using his training to prevent violence, not provoke it. The officers began to whisper among themselves, their voices quiet, their movements careful. The man noticed the subtle shift. They were beginning to recognize the seriousness of their actions and the need to reconsider their approach. He maintained a steady voice, explaining calmly that any illegal actions could result in repercussions. He made sure not to threaten, but his words carried authority, and the officers could sense that he was not bluffing. He observed each officer individually, reading body language, noting tension, hesitation, and uncertainty. He realized that the best way forward was to maintain communication, to keep them aware that he was calm, capable, and fully in control of his own actions. He spoke directly, addressing concerns and guiding their movements without aggression. Every interaction was carefully measured to prevent escalation and ensure safety. At one point, an officer stepped closer, clearly trying to assert control. The man held his ground, keeping his hands visible and speaking calmly. "Please follow proper procedure," he said. "Any reckless action could be dangerous for all of us." His tone was gentle but firm. The officer paused, reassessing the situation. The shift in power was subtle but undeniable. The man's calm, informed presence had created a situation where the officers had to think twice before acting. He then began to guide them further, suggesting ways to de-escalate the situation without confrontation. "Let's step back and make sure we follow the law," he said. "We can resolve this safely if we communicate and stay composed." His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of experience, strategy, and careful observation. The officers, now cautious, began to follow his guidance, moving with more care and deliberation. The man's awareness extended to every detail, the layout of the room, the positioning of furniture, the potential hazards. He moved with subtle precision, making sure he remained ready to act if needed. But his goal was to prevent violence, not provoke it. Each step, each gesture, each word was carefully chosen to guide the officers toward a safe resolution. Minutes passed with slow, tense exchanges. The officers were visibly uneasy, their previous confidence replaced by careful calculation. The man continued to speak calmly, reinforcing the importance of following legal procedures and avoiding reckless behavior. He did not raise his voice, did not make sudden movements, and did not show fear. His composure alone communicated the gravity of the situation and his ability to handle it. He reflected on the principles that had guided him through years of high-pressure situations. Patience, awareness, discipline, and strategic thinking. Those principles were now being applied in his own home, and they were working. The officers were responding to his calm authority, adjusting their behavior, and slowly realizing that they had underestimated him. The man's words and presence began to reshape the environment. The officers' whispers grew quieter, their movements slower, more deliberate. He continued to engage them, using clear, simple instructions, reminding them of the law and subtly demonstrating his awareness of the room and its possibilities. He showed no aggression, but every word and action communicated control, readiness, and capability. He thought about the importance of perception and presence. To the outside world, he remained calm and composed, almost ordinary. But inside, every sense was heightened, every detail observed, every potential action considered. This awareness allowed him to guide the officers safely, to prevent mistakes, and to ensure that the situation did not escalate. His training had prepared him for extreme conditions, and he was now using it in a different but equally critical context. Slowly, the officers began to move toward the exit, their actions careful and deliberate. They had recognized that they had entered a situation far beyond what they had expected. The man maintained his calm presence, allowing them space to leave while still monitoring every movement. He understood that giving them room to retreat was essential to ensuring safety and avoiding confrontation. As the officers left the room, the man remained standing, calm and composed. The tension that had filled the house slowly began to fade, replaced by the quiet strength of someone who had successfully navigated an extraordinary situation. He had maintained control without aggression, guided the interaction with patience and authority, and ensured that everyone remained safe. After the officers were gone, he took a moment to reflect on what had just happened. He had faced a dangerous situation with calm intelligence and strategic thinking. His training, discipline, and awareness had allowed him to maintain control and prevent violence. The experience reinforced the importance of patience, observation, and careful communication in managing high-pressure situations. He knew that this encounter would remain with him, a reminder of how preparation and discipline could transform a potentially dangerous scenario into a manageable one. The neighborhood outside returned to its quiet routine, unaware of the extraordinary events that had just unfolded. Inside the house, the man returned to his calm, measured routine, knowing that he had successfully protected himself and his home. He reflected on the value of composure, awareness, and strategy. By remaining calm, observing carefully, and communicating clearly, he had guided the situation toward a safe resolution. The officers had left, but the lesson was clear. True strength was not about aggression or force, but about control, patience, and the ability to remain composed under pressure. This experience had proven once again that careful thinking and disciplined action could overcome even the most dangerous circumstances, keeping everyone safe and preserving the peace in a world that often underestimated quiet, controlled authority. Even after the officers had stepped back, the tension in the house remained thick. The man's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the officers' uncertainty, and it was clear that they were struggling to regain a sense of control. He knew that this was the critical moment to take charge, not with force but with strategy, patience, and clear communication. He started by speaking calmly, explaining in simple terms what the proper procedure should be. He reminded them that breaking into a house without a warrant was illegal, and that there could be serious consequences if they continued to act recklessly. His voice was steady, composed, yet it carried authority that could not be ignored. The officers paused, listening, and slowly began to understand that they had miscalculated the situation. The man then subtly demonstrated his readiness. He moved with quiet precision, positioning himself where he could see every officer and every exit. His movements were careful, deliberate, and non-threatening, yet they communicated skill, awareness, and control. The officers, now fully aware that they were dealing with someone highly trained, began to behave more cautiously. Their earlier aggression gave way to hesitancy, and they started to reconsider their next steps. As he guided the situation, the man reflected on his past experiences. He had spent years in high-stakes missions where every action, every word, and every movement mattered. Those lessons now applied to his home, a place that should have been safe. He understood that maintaining control without escalating violence required patience, discipline, and clear thinking. He also knew that showing composure and confidence could influence others' behavior more than force ever could. He addressed the officers calmly, but with a tone that demanded attention. "I'm trained for situations like this," he said. "I can handle extreme pressure, but I want to make sure no one gets hurt. Please follow proper procedure and let's resolve this safely." The officers, though hesitant, listened. They had begun to realize that rushing or acting recklessly could lead to serious consequences, not only for themselves but for everyone involved. The man observed each officer carefully, reading their body language and understanding their fears and uncertainties. He maintained a calm, authoritative presence, guiding their movements and encouraging them to act with caution. His words were clear and simple, but they carried weight. The officers' whispers grew quieter, their gestures slower and their posture more tentative. The dynamic in the room had shifted entirely. He subtly reinforced the seriousness of his abilities without showing aggression. Every small movement, adjusting his stance, calmly observing, speaking with clarity, was a reminder that he was capable and aware. The officers were beginning to see that their previous assumptions about the situation had been dangerously wrong. They had underestimated the man's skill, training, and ability to manage high-pressure scenario. First, the man continued to communicate calmly, suggesting ways to de-escalate the situation. "Step back, take a moment, and follow the law," he said. "We can handle this safely if we stay composed and communicate." His approach was measured and non-confrontational, but it made the officers pause and think. They were realizing that rash actions would not only be ineffective but could escalate the situation into something much more dangerous. He moved subtly, ensuring he could observe all exits and each officer's position. His awareness of the space and the people in it created a sense of control that was undeniable. The officers' energy shifted again. They were now tentative, cautious, and increasingly aware that they were in the presence of someone who was not only calm, but fully capable of managing the situation. The man's mind remained focused, constantly assessing and anticipating. Every detail, every sound, and every motion was processed carefully. He remembered the lessons from his training: patience, observation, strategic thinking, and controlled communication. These principles allowed him to maintain authority without aggression and to guide the officers safely through a tense situation. He spoke again, reinforcing the importance of following legal boundaries. "You need to act responsibly," he said. "Ignoring the law could have serious consequences. Let's make sure everyone stays safe." His calm, firm words reminded the officers that they were accountable for their actions. They listened, slowly understanding that the man's knowledge and presence were real and commanding. As time passed, the officers began to retreat further, carefully and deliberately. Their initial confidence had faded, replaced by caution and reflection. The man allowed them space, continuing to monitor every movement while maintaining his calm presence. He knew that giving them room to withdraw was essential to prevent escalation and ensure a peaceful resolution. The man reflected on the importance of control. In high-pressure situations, restraint and observation were often more effective than force. By staying calm, communicating clearly, and demonstrating awareness, he had turned a potentially dangerous situation into a controlled interaction. The officers were beginning to understand that patience, strategy, and calm authority were far more powerful than aggression. He continued to guide the officers, using simple instructions and reminders about legal procedures. His calm demeanor, combined with subtle demonstrations of skill and awareness, influenced their behavior. They began to move carefully, acknowledging the reality that they had underestimated him. Each step they took was measured, reflecting a growing understanding that they were no longer in full control. The tension slowly began to ease as the officers moved toward the exit, fully aware of the seriousness of their mistake. The man maintained his calm, composed stance, allowing them to leave without confrontation. His presence had created an environment where safety and order were restored. And the officers had learned a powerful lesson about restraint and responsibility. Once the officers were gone, the man took a moment to reflect. He had successfully managed a situation that could have become dangerous or even deadly. His training, patience, and disciplined approach had ensured that no one was harmed and that the law was ultimately respected. He returned to his routine, taking a deep breath and regaining a sense of normalcy within his home. He understood that this experience would remain with him as a reminder of the importance of calm authority, awareness, and strategic thinking. By staying composed, observing carefully, and communicating effectively, he had turned a threatening situation into a lesson in discipline and control. The neighborhood outside remained peaceful, unaware of the extraordinary tension that had unfolded within the house. The man's thoughts lingered on the value of preparation and experience. Years of rigorous training, discipline, and high-pressure missions had prepared him for this moment. By applying these skills thoughtfully and strategically, he had ensured safety and maintained control without resorting to violence. This encounter had proven that true strength came from calm intelligence, clear communication, and measured action. As he resumed his daily routine, he carried with him the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had navigated an extraordinary situation successfully. The officer's retreat marked the resolution of the immediate threat, but the lessons about awareness, patience, and control would remain with him. He had once again demonstrated that composure, discipline, and strategic thinking were more powerful than aggression or force, and that maintaining calm authority could prevent conflict and protect everyone involved. The house returned to its usual quiet rhythm, the sunlight streaming through the windows, the sounds of birds and wind filling the air. The man continued his day with a sense of calm confidence, fully aware of the extraordinary events that had unfolded and the strength of character that had allowed him to manage them. He knew that this experience would stay with him, a lasting reminder of the power of calm strategy and disciplined action in the face of unexpected challenges. After the raid, the quiet that settled over the house was almost deafening. The officers who had forced their way in now sat on the couch and chairs, clearly shaken and unsure of what to do next. They had expected an easy confrontation, maybe even some resistance, but what they got was a display of calm, controlled skill that none of them could explain. The man stood near the doorway, his eyes scanning each of them, measuring their reactions and the fear slowly creeping into their faces. He could feel his heart still beating fast, but it wasn't fear. It was that calm alertness that came from decades of training, a state where every second mattered, yet every move was deliberate. He knew that he could have ended the situation in a far more dramatic way, but he didn't. He had no desire to harm anyone unnecessarily. The officers had put themselves in a position of danger, and now they would have to face the consequences of their actions. The man crossed his arms and leaned slightly against the wall, watching them fidget and avoid his gaze. For a moment, he just let them sit there in silence, the tension thick and heavy in the room. Outside, the neighborhood had come alive with whispers. People were talking quietly from their windows, trying to understand what had just happened. The sirens had gone and most of the people had returned to their homes, but the curiosity and unease lingered. Some neighbors had seen the officers enter and leave, while others had only heard the chaos and were left to imagine what had happened. Slowly, a few brave individuals stepped onto their porches, observing the house from a distance, but no one approached. The man didn't mind. He had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving, and he preferred to let others form their own conclusions. Once the immediate tension eased, he spoke in a calm, steady voice, telling the officers that they were lucky to walk away without serious consequences. Ever? The word he spoke carried authority, and there was no anger in it, only the weight of experience. He explained the risks they had taken by entering his home without proper authority and the potential repercussions of their actions. They listened, shifting nervously in their seats, unable to meet his eyes. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply outlined the reality of the situation, making them understand that luck had been on their side this time, but it wouldn't always be. While the officers sat silently, he thought about his family. His mind flicked to his children in their rooms, the fear they must have felt when they heard the commotion and the shouting. He had taught them many things about life, discipline, and safety, but tonight he realized that words alone could not shield them from the chaos of the world. He made a silent promise to himself that he would do everything possible to protect them, to make sure they felt safe and secure in the home that had always been a place of comfort and peace. He went to the kitchen to make some water for his family and for the officers. As he poured the water, he noticed how ordinary everything looked. The small details of everyday life, the cups, the plates, the furniture, reminded him of why he fought to keep his past hidden. He had served his country with honor and had skills that few could match, but he wanted a normal life now, a life where his children could grow up without fear and where the neighborhood could see him as just another person living quietly. Yet the events of tonight had shattered that illusion, revealing to everyone that appearances could be deceiving. When he returned with the glasses of water, he placed them carefully on the table in front of the officers. They hesitated, unsure of whether to accept the gesture, but eventually they drank, the simple act feeling strangely grounding after the chaos. He sat down across from them, maintaining eye contact, letting them understand that this was not just about power or skill. It was about responsibility. The officers were beginning to realize that they had underestimated him, and perhaps more importantly, they were beginning to understand that their actions had consequences far beyond what they had imagined. After some time, the man decided it was time to leave the room and check on his family. He walked quietly down the hallway, peeking into his children's rooms. They were awake but huddled under blankets, wide-eyed and anxious. He smiled gently, kneeling beside them and brushing their hair back from their faces. He told them everything was okay, that no one would hurt them and that he had handled the situation. His voice was calm and soothing, the kind of voice that reassured without needing to raise it. Slowly, his children relaxed, leaning against him, trusting him completely as they always had. Once his family felt safe, he returned to the living room. The officers were silent, some of them staring at the floor, others nervously glancing at each other. He knew that the situation was far from over. There would be an investigation, questions, and reports to write, but he also knew that he had done everything correctly. He had protected his family, asserted his boundaries, and reminded those who had overstepped that actions have consequences. He didn't need to brag or boast. His reputation, built over years of service, spoke for itself. Word of the incident quickly spread. Neighbors whispered among themselves, speculating about the man who had handled the raid so expertly. Some were scared, others were amazed, but all were curious. Slowly, a narrative began to form, not one of fear, but of respect. People realized that the man who had always kept to himself was not someone to be underestimated. They saw that he had a deep sense of responsibility, a calm intelligence, and a moral code that guided his actions. In a way, the incident changed the neighborhood's perception of him, turning him from a quiet figure into someone whose strength was recognized, even if it was only whispered about. Meanwhile, the higher authorities were notified. An internal investigation into the officer's actions was launched. The man cooperated fully, providing statements and evidence to support his account. He knew the law could work in his favor, but he also knew that justice was not always immediate or simple. He remained patient, understanding that truth and fairness often take time. His calm approach, his willingness to cooperate, and the clarity of his story made it impossible for anyone to dispute what had happened. In the days that followed, life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy for the man and his family. He went about his routine, preparing meals, helping with homework, and spending time with his children in ways that had always felt natural. Yet he remained vigilant, knowing that the world could still bring unexpected challenges. He didn't dwell on the past, but he also didn't forget the lessons it had taught him. The raid had reminded him of the fragility of peace and the importance of being prepared without ever seeking conflict. Neighbors began to interact with him differently, showing a mixture of curiosity, respect, and caution. He didn't seek their approval, but he acknowledged their presence with quiet nods and occasional conversations. Slowly, a new kind of understanding formed. People realized that strength could be quiet, that heroism could exist without fanfare, and that even ordinary-looking individuals might carry extraordinary skills and wisdom. As weeks passed, the officers involved in the illegal raid faced disciplinary actions. They were required to attend retraining, write reports, and reflect on their actions. The man's calm and measured approach throughout the process had made a lasting impression on those reviewing the case. It was clear that the man had acted responsibly, ethically, and without unnecessary force. He had shown the world, without raising his voice or seeking attention, that true strength lies in restraint and skill guided by conscience. In the evenings, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the man would sit on his porch, watching his children play in the yard, listening to the distant sounds of the neighborhood, and reflecting on the events of that night. He felt a sense of peace tempered by the awareness that life could change in an instant. But he also felt a quiet pride in knowing that he had handled the situation with integrity, protecting his family and teaching those around him a lesson in respect, responsibility, and courage. The story of the raid, the confrontation, and the revelation of his identity slowly became part of the neighborhood's collective memory. It was told in hushed tones, sometimes with amazement, sometimes with disbelief, but it left a lasting impression, a reminder that appearances can be misleading, that calm intelligence can overcome reckless force, and that true power is measured not by fear, but by the ability to protect, to guide, and to act with honor. In the end, the man's life returned to its quiet rhythm. The neighborhood, once filled with tension and uncertainty, settled into a sense of cautious respect. The officers who had raided his home learned a hard lesson, and the man continued to live with the same principles that had guided him throughout his life: discipline, responsibility, and the quiet strength to face challenges without unnecessary aggression. His family remained safe, his neighborhood more aware, and the man himself remained the calm, watchful protector he had always been, ready for whatever the future might bring, but never seeking conflict, only ensuring that peace and justice were preserved.